Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece for Reason to Resist on August 18th, 2025. In today's report, I'll be speaking with a Palestinian university lecturer who is based in the occupied West Bank. But before I bring our guest into the discussion, I'd like to comment on a major gathering of Western leaders that is taking place in Washington, D.C. today. The background to today's gathering in Washington is as follows. On Friday of last week, August 16th, Donald Trump met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska. After a face-to-face discussion that lasted for less than 3 hours, the two presidents held a 12-minute press conference. In that press conference, they fielded no questions from the press and revealed precious few details about what they had discussed. They did say that they had reached agreement on some key issues relating to the Ukraine war, but that other areas of disagreement remained. Also, Trump stated in that press conference that he would brief Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Washington's European allies on his discussions with President Putin. This past weekend, Trump indeed spoke by telephone with Zelensky and European leaders. Apparently, he briefed them on his talks with the Russian Federation's president. We then learned that Zelensky would travel to the White House today to meet with Donald Trump and that he would not come alone. He will be accompanied by what The Guardian describes as a dream team of European leaders, including British PM Sir Keir Starmer, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, French President Emmanuel Macron, and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Since the Ukraine war began, I've argued repeatedly that one of our highest priorities should be to bring that war to an end by means of negotiation and compromise. And I very much hope that that will be the outcome of today's gathering in Washington. But, and none of you will be surprised to hear me say this if you've been watching our program for any period of time, I'm deeply skeptical that that will be the outcome. And my skepticism is based primarily on the extensive record of Donald Trump in matters of war and peace. I see no credible evidence that Donald Trump seeks a lasting, durable, and just peace in Ukraine, or frankly, in any other part of the world. The evidence is overwhelmingly that he is a neocon, a warmonger, an imperialist, and is absolutely hell-bent on maintaining the U.S. position of global hegemony, assuming that that can be done. I believe that Trump and his European vassals remain committed to the project of Western global hegemony and view the Russian Federation as a major obstacle to that project. Again, I hope very much that I'm wrong about this. But whatever the outcome of today's gathering in Washington will ultimately be, there are two key points I wish to make about today's gathering. First, the predominant narrative in the Western corporate media, which has exploded in indignation at the images of Donald Trump welcoming Vladimir Putin on U.S. soil, is that there is a major divide between the White House on the one hand and European leaders on the other when it comes to what to do about the Ukraine war. Western corporate media clearly want us to believe that Trump is inclined to abandon Ukraine and capitulate to Russia's demands, whereas European leaders are determined to stand by Ukraine until it has achieved victory over Russia. This, I humbly suggest, is nonsense. When the meetings in Washington end today, European leaders, I would contend, will say exactly what Donald Trump wants them to say. If they say, for example, that they will not agree to Russia's core demands and that they plan to continue sending weapons to Ukraine, then they will say these things because Donald Trump wants them to. You see, Donald Trump has a major political problem. His problem is that to win last year's presidential election, he told voters a bald-faced lie. He said that he was going to bring the Ukraine war to an end within 24 hours, as a matter of fact. And he was clearly addressing himself to a substantial body of U.S. Voters who are fed up with America's forever wars. Now, not only has Trump failed to end the Ukraine war, but on his watch, the carnage in Palestine has continued, and new U.S. wars were launched against Yemen and Iran. So Donald Trump, who is in reality an arch neocon, needs scapegoats for his refusal to end the Ukraine war. The scapegoats will be Volodymyr Zelensky and the Europeans who accompany Zelensky to the White House. And as a footnote, I have to note that Prime Minister Goldman Sachs, otherwise known as Mark J. Carney, the Canadian leader, apparently will not be joining these European leaders at the gathering in Washington, despite the fact that Canada has contributed some $20 billion to support Ukraine. I would have thought that $20 billion will buy you at a bare minimum a seat at the table. But apparently, even though Canada is one of the largest contributors to Ukraine's war effort, it has not been invited to this potentially historic event. Now, as I say, I believe at the end of the day, the Europeans and Zelensky will take the blame for Trump's latest failure to end the Ukraine war, and they will take the blame because Donald Trump needs them to do that. I say it a third time. I very much hope that I'm wrong about all of this, but we shall see. The second comment I want to make about today's gathering in Washington is this. Every single participant in today's meeting at the White House is a war criminal. Let us not forget, not for one instant, that Trump, Macron, Starmer, Merz, and von der Leyen are all perpetrating a genocide in occupied Palestine. They're not simply complicit. They are participants, direct participants, for a variety of reasons in this genocidal war on the Palestinian people. Their lofty rhetoric about international law and human rights is a pack of lies. If they truly cared about such things, they would have sanctioned the bejesus out of Israel's genocidal regime long ago. Whenever Western leaders lecture Russia or any other non-Western country about human rights or international law, the press corps should fall over in uproarious laughter. That would be a logical reaction. Rather, they take these claims seriously and dignify them as though there's a shred of truth to them. At this stage, it's simply mind-boggling that anyone would take Western leaders seriously when they pontificate about international law or human rights. And on that note, let me introduce our guest today. So today we are going to be speaking with Abboud Hamayel. Abboud is an analyst, writer, and lecturer at Birzeit University in the occupied West Bank, and he joins us today from Ramallah. Thank you so much for coming on to Reason to Resist.
Thank you, Dimitri. Glad to be with you.
So Abboud, I'd like to begin our discussion with a recent spectacle put on by Israel's National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir. I suspect that you're well familiar with this, but perhaps some people in our audience have not seen it. So again, for those who aren't familiar with the persons featured in that video, what we just saw was Ben-Gvir speaking to Marwan Barghouti in an Israeli prison. And there are multiple indications that in recent months, Mr. Barghouti has been beaten repeatedly, malnourished, and has been consigned repeatedly for extended periods to solitary confinement. In May of this year, the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research conducted a poll. One of the questions it asked in that poll was this: if presidential elections were held in Palestine between three candidates, Marwan Barghouti, Mahmoud Abbas, and Khalil Mishal of Hamas, how would you vote? The poll found that 50% would vote for Marwan Barghouti, 35% for the Hamas candidate, and a paltry 11% for Mahmoud Abbas, who has served as president of the Palestinian Authority for the past 20 years or so. 7 months ago, the same polling firm found that the support for Marwan Barghouti among voters stood at 46%, Hamas's candidate at 44%, and Abbas at 9%. And Mr. Barghouti has been imprisoned by Israel since 2002, so he's obviously in little position to build a political movement, and yet he consistently emerges as a top choice of Palestinian voters. So Abboud, my first question, and perhaps the most obvious one, is why do you believe that Marwan Barghouti enjoys, even to this very day, so much support from Palestinians living under occupation?
Well, I think it's for multiple reasons. One of them is that Marwan belongs to the Fatah movement, which still has a large, if you want, social base specifically tied to the Palestinian Authority, and of course its bureaucratic, stature in the occupied territories. The capacity for this movement to basically create clientist networks through hiring people in this bloated bureaucracy, if you want. So there's a lot of social. There's a big social base on which people like Marwan Barghouti could also base their own political fortune. That's one part of it. But the second part of it, which is important, is that Marwan is, an echo of the past, of Fatah's past, which is a revolutionary past. As you well know, and perhaps your audience also knows, the Fatah of the 70s and 80s, which held a revolutionary project in the Middle East, positioned itself, outside of Palestine, creating the PLO and working towards the liberation of Palestine. Today, that Fatah perhaps has changed into this kind of, again, bureaucratic movement that is on one level still conducting security cooperation with the Israelis, while the Israelis annex more land, kill more people in the West Bank, etc. So Fatah basically is this kind of reminder from the past, an echo from the past of the glory of the Fatah movement itself. And I think the third reason is because Marwan is still a person not only imprisoned, so that arouses a lot of political sympathy, but also a person that is both committed to pragmatic solutions, but at the same time one that would not necessarily be ideologically committed like Mahmoud Abbas to a position of impotence, political impotence, but one that would use whatever leverage or power the Palestinian Authority have to ensure that the Palestinians might come out in the struggle with Israel with something to speak of. So he has this kind of dual, if you want, outlook, one that is willing to engage in resistance, one who's willing to negotiate at the same time. That kind of negotiation and resisting paradigm that has been missing, at least for the past 20 years since Mahmoud Abbas has taken the helm of politics, and who insists on a politics of inoperability, of not engaging with Israel, not challenging Israel in the occupied territories, and maintaining security cooperation at any cost.
I think it was last year, The Economist, of all magazines, published an article describing Marwan Barghouti as the world's most important prisoner. That was the headline. And certainly, given his consistent popularity amongst Palestinians, one would have thought that this genocidal entity would regard Marwan Barghouti as a threat that needs to be eliminated. Now, I know I'm asking you to try to read the mind of the lunatic leadership of Israel, but why do you think they've not killed Marwan Barghouti? Why is he still alive today when they're willing to cross every red line imaginable?
Well, I mean, I think there's multiple reasons for it. I think on one level, I mean, if you're an Israeli, for instance, let's say strategist, you would think that perhaps at some point in the future, Marwan might become necessary. You need a Palestinian political figure that perhaps could negotiate with Israel, could go through a process through which he would also be positioned to convince the Palestinians of making some concessions or engaging in some sort of talks or re-legitimizing, for instance, a hollowed out Palestinian Authority. So from an Israeli perspective, it's always useful to have him in the background, even if you're not going to use him as an option. Specifically, if you have a problem, for instance, in the management of the occupied territories in the West Bank, and you need some sort of figure that the Palestinians could unify around. So Marwan comes to the fore as somebody who might be in that position. So there's that element, and that comes mostly from Israeli strategists who are pragmatic. So it's Shabak, Shin Bet officials, people who have engaged throughout their whole careers, of course, in the brutal crackdown and the implementation of this terror regime that we live under in the occupied territories, arresting whoever they want at their whims, placing tens of thousands of Palestinians under torture, but at the same time have this kind of understanding of Palestinian society and therefore build policy recommendation based on that. And I think the second element, from this pragmatic, if you want, security side, is that now they're being challenged by, as you said, a more ideologically committed, lunatic, zero-sum game type of politicians, including people like Itamar Ben-Gvir, including people like Bezalel Smotrich, who represent something in the collective unconscious of Israelis, of course, across the board. I'm not saying that these are exceptions in Israeli society. In fact, this desire to eliminate and humiliate Palestinians, as you saw in the video, is so deeply ingrained in Israeli society. But they want this zero-sum game to basically unfold endlessly with the Palestinians, meaning that killing Palestine, killing the Palestinians, killing any future for Palestinians on the land of Palestine from the river to the sea, and ensuring that there's no future, as some of the placards that the settlers raised in the West Bank clearly stated. They raised these banners saying there's no future in Palestine. So there's that element of which you have this kind of ideological settler, religious Zionist messianic group committed to the killing and elimination of the Palestinian people as a people, whether physically or symbolically or politically or all together. And they're now leading the Israeli government. They're now the ones, engaging in this kind of attack on Israeli institutions and taking them over. They're the ones that are sidelining this old Ashkenazi, pragmatic, if you want, more pragmatic elite who committed similar massacres in 1948 and 1967 and across the board. But now they're the ones that are engaging and ensuring that they can entrench this greater Israel idea including the genocide that is taking place in the Gaza Strip. So they see in Marwan Barghouti somebody that must be humiliated, like Itamar Ben-Gvir just did, and somebody who should be eventually eliminated. And I think part of the idea there in this video is this flirtation with this idea that Itamar Ben-Gvir, for reasons of legal restrictions within Israel, and of course because of that kind of security pragmatic point I outlined earlier, still is incapable of, for instance, just executing somebody like Marwan Barghouti in prison or other leaders that are also in prison at this particular moment.
I understand that Mahmoud Abbas won only one election, and that was back in 2005, and that his term expired no later than 2010. He's consistently treated by Western governments as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Is it fair to say that amongst Palestinians living in the West Bank, he is no longer viewed as having, obviously there's still some people who support him, but that the majority no longer view him as having any democratic legitimacy at all?
Yeah, it's fair. I don't think there's anybody that is actually in debate around that. Of course, Mahmoud Abbas is not popular. Actually, he arouses a lot of, even if you want, emotions of hatred among some people in the West Bank as well. So it's not only a passive dislike of the figure. Sometimes it's more proactive, specifically with the cohort around Mahmoud Abbas now leading the Palestinian Authority as well. So in large part, nobody I think would argue that Mahmoud Abbas is popular or has any sort of legitimacy in the eyes of the Palestinians. The only legitimacy, and this is not legitimacy in the classical sense of the word, but the only thing going on or going for the Palestinian Authority and its leadership currently is this images that are now coming from the Gaza Strip, the brutal killing of Palestinians, massacres at 8 sites, humiliation, torture, famine, and which people in the West Bank are so terrified that this is a scenario that will also slowly but assuredly unfold in the West Bank, that they're willing at this particular moment in their history to basically just hope that this idea of cooperating with Israel, this idea of security coordination, this idea of placing your bet on American, European diplomatic protection alongside the Israeli need for, at least for now, for an Israeli native authority to manage the Palestinians, at least economically and on some level of civic, in some civic areas as well, that will actually make the Palestinians survive. This is the only logic, if you want, that is, going for the Palestinian Authority. Just a logic of being terrified, being afraid, having, seen the world stand in silence as Israel commits these crimes live streamed across the globe, having seen the cowardness of European leaders not being able to take any position that would actually meaningfully halt the genocide, and of course having seen American, a political establishment and its foreign policy establishment continue to support Israel with weapons and arms, despite all the horrific massacres going on for 2 years. So we're not talking about months or weeks. So this is what's shocking for Palestinians across Palestine. It's not really shocking for us that Israel is doing what it's doing, because that type of sadism is something that we've experienced throughout our history in prisons, in torture chambers. It's not surprising to us to see that gleeful soldiers, engaging in killing in Gaza and high-fiving each other for killing children or, wearing lingerie. This is not something that actually shocked us. What shocked us is that the world gives diplomatic cover and weapons and continues to support the ongoing genocide with no end in sight. And therefore, when you're a Palestinian in the West Bank, you live under this a terror regime that basically implicitly threatens you with the same type of treatment that Gaza is now, going through. That's the only thing that is going for the Palestinian Authority.
I was in actually, I was in occupied West Bank and in 48 Israel last April. And I don't know if you know this, I'm a lawyer by background, do a lot of work in international law, and I have a particular view about the scope of this genocide, which I'm going to share with you. But before I tell you what that is, when I was there, I visited the Jenin refugee camp several times. There were atrocities being committed on a daily basis. The Israeli forces were clearly trying to destroy the infrastructure of the camp and render it unlivable. I understand it's now been largely depopulated. I saw similar conditions in the Tulkarm refugee camp. And my overall impression, for those and a host of other reasons, is that from a legal perspective, this genocide is not confined to the Gaza Strip. Absolutely, it is there where it is happening with a level of intensity that is unmatched anywhere else in historic Palestine. But this is a Palestine-wide project, in my view. But this is I'm as a lawyer looking from the outside. I had a brief glimpse from within. I'm curious to know what your view about this is. Do you think that currently the people of the occupied West Bank are being subjected to a genocide as well?
Well, I do think so. I mean, I'm not saying that, and this is, I think, fundamental and important to really grasp. I don't think that even Gaza, I mean, in most of Israeli discourse, specifically this right-wing messianic groups that we spoke about, is not as important as the West Bank. The West Bank is the prize for this movement at this current moment in its history. It's 5,000 kilometers squared. It cuts through the middle of one of the most populated areas within Israel, the Rosh Dan area, which is where Tel Aviv is and where all of these major urban centers are. It's the area with a lot of water resources, a lot of, if you want, also natural resources that could be used up by the state. And therefore, there's a lot of, at least, strategic, political, geographic interests, not only in maintaining control of the West Bank, but also in ensuring that, there is an Israeli sovereignty completely enacted legally, politically, etc., within the West Bank. So if you're looking from a historical perspective, of course, what's happening in Gaza will not stay in Gaza. But for a lot of different historical reasons, this is part of how colonialism can entrench itself sometimes in the minds of people. It divides, it cuts through geographies, it creates different identities. The idea that I'm somebody from the West Bank is it's in large part is a colonial, production. It's not something actually intrinsic. I mean, historically speaking, I'm from a place called Jabal al-Quds, or the Mount of Jerusalem, not the West Bank. If we wanted to use our own indigenous language to speak of it. So, West Bank cutting it from Gaza. I'm somebody who's 37-year-old, never been to Gaza, can't go to Gaza, never had, this kind of relationship with one part of your own society, at least seeing the city or its people. And, so there's that kind of cutting, and it's a cutting that also goes through different procedures. For instance, Gaza was under siege. In the West Bank, Israelis permitted us to have 3G networks. In Gaza, it's only 2G. So it's not only a division geographically where we can't see each other and interact with each other, but also it is, an economic hierarchy that is created. If you're from Jerusalem, you have access to the Israeli market as a laborer, as a pharmacist, as a doctor. If you're from the occupied West Bank, you have 3G. If you're from Gaza, you're besieged with little electricity, but at the same time with 2G networks. So it creates also these hierarchies. At this current moment, you can also see in the intensity of violence something along these divisions, which is that in Gaza, you have brutal, designs of massacres, quite diabolical designs. For instance, luring people to 8 sites and then shooting them, or killing people through constant air bombardment, or other forms of massacres that we have seen unfold throughout the past 2 years in the Gaza Strip. And for the Palestinians, I mean, that is a scenario when they look at the Palestinians in the West, that's the scenario they're trying to now, at least in their heads, prevent. It doesn't mean that they will prevent, but that's what they think some sort of passivity at this particular historical moment will actually incur. At the same time, what is actually paradoxical, Dimitri, is that Israelis are now speaking, specifically Israeli strategists are now speaking, for instance, of the West Bank model of the camps that you just mentioned, like Jenin camp, where they entered, destroyed the camp, and are staying there, creating some sort of military base within the camp. So this policy of killing the camp, in Jenin and Tul Karim specifically, is the one that they want to implement in the Gaza Strip. So you see the connection as well. It's not, they want to enter, for example, Gaza City, occupy it, ethnically cleanse the population that exists in the Gaza City, and then stay and remain within the city for the long term. That is at least the idea that is being now moved from the West Bank onto the Gaza Strip as Israel, buys time and tries through this, temporal deferral of this war to gain as much, political gains that it can, and of course flirt with the idea of ethnically cleansing the entire population of the Gaza Strip as well. So in the West Bank, things are rolling. The settlers are becoming more violent. We've seen lynching attacks happening all over the West Bank. We've seen these type of killing the camp form of engagement in which Israelis go destroy the camp physically, at the same time stay for the long period, displacing around 40,000 Palestinians. And of course, it will continue through different means, through economic means, economic sanctions, choking the Palestinian economy here, encouraging people to immigrate, in this kind of light sense of immigration. But eventually, of course, it will have to use a large dosage of violence to be able to even get the Palestinians to contemplate the idea of actually removing themselves from the land.
One of the things I did when I was there last year in Palestine, I spent a good bit of time in East Jerusalem. And this was, by the way, during the month of Ramadan, which may have had something to do with what I witnessed. But I was surprised at how little protest there was amongst the Palestinians of East Jerusalem. I saw some very minor protest activity at the entrances to Al-Aqsa Mosque when, I could see young Palestinian men were being prevented from entering. They allowed me in, which was interesting, but they clearly were blocking a lot of young Palestinian men from entering, and that was causing a bit of a problem. But it was extraordinarily quiet. And what do you think accounts for that? I certainly witnessed more acts of resistance when I was in the West Bank. Do you think it's just simply a reign of terror, that the people there are absolutely horrified that they will be subjected to the same sadism that the people of Gaza have experienced if they put up any kind of resistance, or is there something else going on there?
Well, I mean, this is one of the elements that Israel was successful in, and in fact, it's one of the most horrifying, if you want, outcomes or ongoing outcomes of this war. This, in Gaza, there's a feeling of abandonment, growing, and to some extent, if you're now in Gaza and looking at the West Bank, looking at the Palestinians, citizens of Israel, looking at Palestinians in Jerusalem, and not seeing any movement, any form of political protest happening, you would think that your own people have abandoned you. That at this particular moment, you're facing all this torture and massacres without voices coming to the fore, without movements emerging or erupting. So there's that element of, if you want, this tragic, if you want, even entrenchment of distance, effective political distance between Gaza, the West Bank, and other parts of Palestine, even the Palestinians in the diaspora as well in Jordan and other places. So that's one of the most, if you want, horrifying outcomes of this war. But it has a reason, of course, because you live within the domain of this regime of terror. And when you see your jailer going lunatic, becoming, somebody who's, completely changed the paradigm. I mean, this is what I want to say. This madness is not necessarily a madness that comes out of, a psychological condition. I mean, it's a calculated madness. that now I'm going to go, I'm not going to think about repercussions. I'm going to kill people in mass. I'm going to arrest people and put them in hunger, as you saw, for instance, Marwan Barghouti, how much weight he's lost, the conditions of isolation that he's in, the humiliation, the constant humiliation in the prisons. So Israel, from the outset of this war, imprisoned a lot of young Palestinians in the West Bank and Jerusalem, cracked down, changed the character of the prison to this constant humiliation. We're getting stories of Palestinian prisoners being brutally beaten every day, no food, or very little food, only keeping them alive, malnutrition, losing a lot of kilograms, and at the same time, in some cases, even forcing the Palestinians to bark or to engage in these kind of self-humiliating acts by Israeli jailers. So that's the picture that emerged from in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, among Palestinian citizens of Israel. If you even speak, you'll be arrested. If you even be beaten and humiliated and subjected to this type of constant torture. So for many Palestinians outside of Gaza, the idea of doing something and feeling helpless, and at the same time, the idea of doing something that doesn't feel effective on a tactical level, couples together to create this moment of impotence. So there's no political, ability to actually force yourself into the public scene without risking your life. And at the same time, knowing too well that if Israel can get away with what it's doing with Gaza, what will stop it from committing a massacre in Jerusalem or committing a massacre in the West Bank or committing multiple massacres? There won't be necessarily an outcry from the world. There won't be a stop to the flow of arms. People might condemn rhetorically, but eventually, we're faced with this mad form of terror regime alone, without any real backing or support, at least materially. So I think at that particular moment, that sense of fear cripples, the Palestinian body more broadly. I'm sorry it took a long time to explain this, but I think it's important to understand. Yeah, I mean, at this particular moment in our history, even before October 2023, you could have spoken about a more active movement emerging in the West Bank, an armed movement in the north, a more popular movement as well in other parts. But at this particular moment, there's a total absence of that, and total absence of organizations that are willing to actually, engage in the mobilization of people at this particular moment. It's just fear, helplessness, impotence, and at the same time, a sense of shame of not being able to do something for Gaza.
Now, recently, Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich announced an Israeli plan to build 3,400 housing units in the so-called E1 area between Jerusalem and the illegal Israeli settlement known as Mal Adumim. Smotrich claims that this project will, quote, bury the idea of a Palestinian state, close quote. One could argue that the concept of a Palestinian state was buried long ago. But I'm curious, as someone, again, living in the West Bank and geographically quite close to Jerusalem, what do you make of the significance of this new project? This has been on the back burner for some time, but it was viewed as being so provocative, so controversial that they never actually, decided to go forward with this particular settlement project. Do you think that this is going to kill any prospect of the two-state solution, or do you think that was already killed long ago?
Well, look, personally, I always say that you could. We talk a lot about killing the two-state solution. Now, I'm not somebody that committed to this idea of a two states, or don't even think that it's necessarily the solution. But and I think it's much more convenient from an imperial perspective to have this land division being constructed. I don't think it actually provides justice or restorative justice for Palestinian refugees as well. So there's a lot of problems with this solution. But just from the perspective of two states, nothing is killed as long as there's enough pressure on Israel to incentivize it to move the settlers from much of the settlements deep, specifically in the West Bank. So you can build the settlement, but eventually if there's enough pressure to move the settler population or to find another arrangement, you can still create some sort of two states. I mean, so I don't think it would actually kill anything or not kill anything. It depends on on whether the world, the US here, Europe, is willing to actually create enough incentives and de-incentives for the Israeli political class to ensure that it has to embark on this process of allowing more land for the Palestinians to emerge, more contiguity in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and at the same time move some of the settlers in that process. So this is I think a Israeli trope of always insisting that the two-state solution is killed. And why they're insisting on this? Because then there's no other solution except one solution in Israeli eyes, which is ethnic cleansing and genocide and the replacement of the Palestinians with Israeli settlers. That's what the position will lead you to, from at least a Zionist perspective. Now, I'm somebody, again, I'm not necessarily in favor of the two-state solution. I don't think it's a solution that actually solves much. It gives more land to the Palestinians, perhaps allows us to live without the constant harassment and terror that the Israelis subject us to. But beyond these kind of gains on everyday life levels, and perhaps being able to live in a slightly more free space, it will still be a dependent, demilitarized Palestinian state that can be violated endlessly by Israel if this type of state emerges. So this is why I don't think it is a solution, a real solution to our predicament. I think the solution should be that people are treated equally and that there's a restoration of Palestinian rights within the broader, geography of Palestine between the river and the sea.
Right. On the subject of the two-state solution, recently France and Canada announced that they would recognize the state of Palestine. Apparently, they plan to do that in September. The Canadian Prime Minister was a little bit equivocal on this point. He was talking about the need for democratic reform and so forth. But it seemed like he was making a commitment to do that. And then you had British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. He was saying he might recognize the state of Palestine. This would be contingent upon whether Israel was being somewhat less satanic in its treatment of the Palestinian people in Gaza. That's not the way he put it, of course. That's my own characterization. But in any event, standing on the outside looking at this, how this appears to me as a non-Palestinian is that Western leaders are desperately trying to avoid imposing any real accountability upon Israel. But at the same time, they're under intense pressure, increasing pressure, I believe, and the polls reflect this in the West, to take meaningful action to stop the genocide. And so they're engaging in what is effectively kabuki theater by saying that they will or might recognize a Palestinian state. And from my perspective, there's absolutely no prospect whatsoever of this actually stopping the genocide or stopping the settlement expansion. And I think one powerful piece of evidence in that regard is the fact that after they made these announcements, Smotrich comes out and says, we're going to build 3,400 new housing units in this extraordinarily important part of the West Bank. So the recognition of a Palestinian state appears to be deterring absolutely no one in the Israeli political elite, as far as I can tell. From your perspective as a Palestinian living under occupation, do you view this favorably, these announcements that these three governments will or might recognize a Palestinian state, or do you also view this as being purely performative?
I think it's purely performative. I think it's empty symbolic gestures that have no consequences on what happens or unfolds in the current genocidal war in the Gaza Strip, but at the same time, in the West Bank more broadly. And I think you just pointed out a lot of the dynamics around it. I mean, it's interesting. The extent to which also Israelis like to be provoked. You want to recognize Palestine, UK? Now we're going to build and destroy your E1 plan. And they're challenging, they're openly challenging these governments. And unfortunately, these governments have no dignity, no sense of self, and they continue to send arms and they continue to send, weapons, and they continue to send the means through which Israel is committing this genocide. And beyond this kind of, dynamic, we should realize that Israel is a dependent colony. It needs Western arms. It needs the industrial base of the United States. It needs, American money coming in, flows it cannot survive. It cannot breathe without these. No matter what Zionism says in terms of its own mythology of building this autonomous, independent, state, but this kind of state is still highly dependent, and we saw this unfold throughout this war, at least on a military level. So it needs the West, it needs Europe, it needs the United States of America, and at the same time, you want to recognize Palestine. Okay, we're going to build settlements in E1 because Europe has made a big issue around the E1 because it's this area that, at least in terms of the geography, means cutting the West Bank into half and makes it impossible for the Palestinians to have any contiguity between, Jabal al-Khalil, the Hebron area, Bethlehem, and of course, Ramallah and north of the West Bank and Jerusalem itself. So that's its importance, and the Europeans made a big issue. And you see that dynamic. Okay, you want to recognize Palestine? We're going to abuse the Palestinians more, annex more of their land, build more settlements, kill more of them, as a form of how Israelis also find a way to assert their power and dominance in the relationship with Europe and the United States in many ways, because these governments are in many ways willing to let them get away with it. So this is one element of it, but I think it's an empty gesture. We Palestinians want the end of impunity. We want the world to stop having anything to do with our deaths. That's all we're asking for all the governments and countries and peoples that are sending weapons or their tax money going to Israel. All we're asking is that you don't engage and don't give Israel the means through which it's committing its genocide, its killing, its torture of the Palestinians, its surveillance, all the means that Israel is using. So that's what we're asking from governments and people's movements, is that they work on ending that impunity rather than an empty symbolic gesture that doesn't really do anything. So what does it mean? Okay, you recognize a Palestinian state, and then we have an ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. So what? We have this kind of empty shell of a symbolic recognition. That's exactly what happened when the Balfour Declaration, spoke about, enacting or building a Jewish homeland on Palestine, while preserving the rights, at least through the language of the Balfour Declaration, preserving the rights, civic and economic, of the non-Jewish population of Palestine. And we saw in 1948 how these rights were violated through a massive ethnic cleansing campaign. And the Balfour Declaration, even on its own terms, which was problematic in of itself, did not even live up to the idea of preserving the rights of the Palestinian people. These type of symbolic gestures have nothing to do with changing material reality on the ground. And I agree with you. I think these governments are trying to, manage the dissent that is increasingly growing in the West. In the U.S., we're seeing figures like Zohran Mamdani coming, or winning in New York City the Democratic nomination for mayorship. We're seeing big shifts in public opinion. We're seeing the dominance of Israel, and Zionism on American society, its hegemony for a long time being displaced, at least, if not totally and irreversibly, being positioned as something to abhor and to work against, and eventually, of course, some sort of moral compass is emerging where your position on Palestine will signal whether you're morally in the right camp, whether you are a decent person, whether I think that's what's happening increasingly in the West, and I think these governments are trying to manage this dissent and trying to give little concessions which mean nothing, and postponing them, deferring them, and making them contingent. Perhaps, maybe we will recognize Palestine, maybe not. So signaling this kind of weak, feeble, symbolic gestures that mean nothing, and of course at the same time cracking down on people's movement. We saw what happened in the UK with the Palestine Action. We're seeing also that in the United States with the arrest of students, and with Trump clamping down a lot of the Palestinian or pro-Palestinian movement in the United States and North America more broadly.
And the last question I have for you is a very big picture question, Abboud, and it's one that I harp on a lot about, and I'm really interested in your perspective on this. I'm fed up with hearing people say, that Israel is the tail wagging the American dog, and somewhere deep down in their hearts, many of these Western politicians, they want to help the Palestinians, but they're afraid of the Israel lobby, and they're terrified that they'll be called anti-Semites. I actually am of the school of thought that Israel pretty much does exactly what Washington wants it to do, and and that most people in the political elite of major Western countries, not just the United States, people, the decision makers, that they are ideologically aligned with the Israeli political elite, and that they more or less want Israel to carry this genocide out. That's my view, and we can go on and on about my reasons for that, but I'm just curious about what your perspective on all of this is. Do you think that the Israel lobby is holding a sort of political gun at the head of all of these Western leaders, and they're being forced to do this against their will, or do you think that they're pretty much on board with Israel's agenda?
Well, I mean, it's hard. This is one of the toughest questions. I always contemplate and think a lot about, Dimitri. I might not have a position on it, a concrete position, meaning that on the one hand, you can see on some level how the lobby, operates to also maintain, if you want, disciplined support of Israel. So this doesn't mean that the establishment itself is not engaged in backing Israel, does not want the policy outcomes that we're seeing, but there's some internal dissent, disciplining mechanism that the lobby provisions and is capable of maintaining, because it's growing more costly as well, or it could grow more costly if you have a lot of dissent in Congress, if you have a lot of dissent, for instance, among some of the American political elites, or you have different point of views coming to the fore. That would crack some of the support that at least some of the more Zionist or ideologically aligned, if you want, leadership or political class in the U.S. Has. So there is a role for the lobby. I don't think we can place, as you said, everything on the lobby's back, because I think, as you said, Israel is this kind of strategic investment. It helps manage the American imperial, let's say, interest in the Middle East. It had a big hand in defeating Arab nationalism. It had a big hand now in also containing, or at least working towards the defeat of the resistance axis, from Iran to Hezbollah. It has this ability to also create a lot of divisions in the Arab world, changing and shifting loyalties among some of the minorities within the Arab world. So it has a lot of, if you want, efficacy for a region that is strategic geographically, that is opposite of Europe on the Mediterranean, and at the same time one with a lot of oil and economic resources that the empire wants and needs, and continuously depends upon, specifically Europeans with Arab oil at least. So there's a lot of that going on as well, and Israel could be seen from this light as being this kind of strategic, strategic asset for the empire and empire building in the region, and that's why the British invested in it, the French invested in it, and then also the Americans took up Israel and became its biggest backer. But having said that, And I mean, of course, a lot of the other ideological investments and psychic investments, the story of Jews in Europe being ejected and rejected, undergoing, this experience of the Holocaust, and how it interplays with the construction of, European identity post-World War II, the idea of, German, whatever collective guilt that is associated with that history, the idea of the Holy Land, and these kind of Christian fantasies around the Holy Land coming from some of the Zionist Christians. So there's a lot of ideological fantasies, a lot of memory politics as well, things that get entangled, in this very narrow strip of land where I live, and where, the land doesn't seem as amazing or as holding that kind of enchantment as for a lot of people in the world, at least when they look at it from outside and, fetishize around it. But at least from my point of view, I'm not sure where to locate, everything. There is, I do hope. I mean, when you have people's movements, when you have people engaging in dissent, when you have workers rejecting, sending weapons through their ports, when you have, European labor unions organizing themselves around the prevention of genocide, we do hope in Palestine that some also electoral, victories that can impact the situation or have some sort of change, or perhaps at least for the peoples of Europe, for the peoples of America to realize the extent to which their governments are not actually democratic nor responsive to their to their opinions, to their what they desire, that the institutions are being hollowed out, that the universities are becoming increasingly complicit with the Trump regime, for instance, in the United States, but also with genocide more broadly, that their political class does not really care that much of their opinion, and that this whole democratic system that they live under is not as responsive, is not as, as liberals would say, is not as liberal, if you want, as it may to seem, and that there are core interests within these countries that when it comes to Israel, and core rhetoric and core discourse when it comes to Israel becomes not important. In fact, what we're seeing now unfold in Gaza is something of a revelation, unconcealment of truth for the people of Greece and the people of the UK and the people of the United States of America and other peoples, a truth that their governments don't stand for what is morally right. They have no ethical compass. In fact, what drives them is this idea of domination, of building hierarchies among peoples across the globe, and maintaining empire is the ultimate aim.
There is no doubt that this genocide has been quite a revelation for people across the West. And, if I can sum up my views about this for what it's worth, Abboud, when I look at the polls, I think I'm convinced that help is on the way. It's taken far too long, and it may not be forthcoming immediately. But I'll just mention one poll, which for me was really an eye-opener. 63% of Canadians recently said in a poll that Canada should recognize the state of Palestine, even if the Trump administration, which threatened the Canadian government over this, threatened them with trade consequences, even if there is a trade price to be paid by Canada. And this, I don't recall ever seeing a poll in which a substantial majority of Canadians took the side of Palestine in situations where taking the side of Palestine would cost them something. The fact that they're willing to pay a price is a monumental change. And I think that this is something we're seeing across the West. But in any case, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Please stay safe, and I hope we can continue the conversation in the weeks ahead.
Thank you, Dimitri. Thank you for having me as well.
And this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on August 18th, 2025.